midnight visitor.
It was just after midnight when the knocking began. Soft at first, barely noticeable, it almost blended with the creaks of the old house settling in for the night. Sarah lay in bed, her eyes half closed, hovering on the edge of sleep when she heard it. A light tap, tap, tap against the glass of her bedroom window. She sat up slowly, blinking the fog of near sleep from her eyes. Her heart quickened as she glanced at the clock on her nightstand, 12:03 a.m. The tapping continued, a steady rhythm that set her nerves on edge. She told herself it was probably just the wind or the branches of the large oak tree outside scraping against the glass. But deep down, she knew it wasn't. There was no tree near her window. Cautiously, Sarah slid out from under the covers, her bare feet hitting the cold wooden floor with a soft thud. She hesitated before moving toward the window, the tapping now louder, more insistent. Her fingers hovered over the edge of the curtain, every muscle in her body tense, a strange, irrational fear creeping into her mind. It's nothing, she told herself. You're being paranoid. Just look, and it'll be nothing. With a quick, sharp breath, she yanked the curtain aside, expecting to see an empty, dark night beyond. But what she saw froze her blood. A figure stood just outside her window, staring in at her. It was tall, impossibly thin, its shape barely distinguishable against the blackness of the night. The figure's face, or what should have been its face, was obscured, swallowed by shadow. But its eyes, or where its eyes should have been, glowed faintly. Two pinpricks of light in the dark, locked on her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Sarah stumbled back, her breath catching in her throat. The figure didn't move, didn't flinch. It just stood there, watching. She gasped, her heart thundering in her chest. Without thinking, she grabbed the curtain and yanked it closed, backing away until her legs hit the edge of her bed. She sat down hard, her mind racing. What was that? It couldn't have been real. Maybe she was still dreaming. Maybe she'd imagined the whole thing. She had to have. But the tapping resumed, louder this time, more insistent. Tap, 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 as if it was trying to get her attention. Sarah's pulse quickened. She had locked the window earlier that evening, double-checking it before she went to bed, just as she did every night since she'd started noticing strange things happening around the house. Things that couldn't be explained. The scratching sounds in the walls, the lights flickering in the hallway, the creaks and groans of the house that felt too deliberate, too intentional to be mere settling. And now this. The figure outside the window wasn't going away. Gathering her courage, she forced herself to stand and took a step toward the window. Her hand trembled as she reached for the curtain again, her breath shallow and quick. She yanked it back, ready to confront whatever it was, but the figure was gone. The space outside the window was empty, the night silent once again. Relief flooded through her, but it was short-lived. Her mind raced with questions. Who had been standing there? Why? And how had they disappeared so quickly? She considered calling the police but stopped herself. What would she tell them? Bet she'd seen a shadowy figure outside her window in the middle of the night. They'd chalk it up to a prank or worse, to her imagination running wild. Sarah took a deep breath and stepped away from the window, her hands trembling. She needed to calm down. Maybe she was overreacting. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, a shadow from a passing car or something. She'd check the window lock one more time, then go back to bed and try to sleep. She walked over to the window, running her fingers over the cold glass. The lock was still in place, just as she'd left it. The room felt colder than usual, but that was probably just her nerves. She pulled the curtain closed again, tighter this time, and crawled back into bed, pulling the blankets up to her chin. She lay there for what felt like hours, her eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling, every little creak of the house making her jump. The tapping didn't return, and slowly, exhaustion began to take over. Her eyelids grew heavy, and she drifted off into a restless sleep. But that night, the dreams came. They started out hazy, indistinct, but quickly became vivid, terrifying. She was standing in her bedroom, just as she had earlier, but this time, the room was darker, the air thick and heavy. The window was open, the curtains billowing gently in a cold breeze, and standing in the middle of the room was the figure. It was closer now, no longer outside the window but inside, its shadowy form filling the room with a presence that made her stomach churn with dread. It stood still, its face, if it had one, hidden in shadow, but she could feel its eyes on her, burning into her with an intensity that made her blood run cold. She tried to move, to scream, but her body wouldn't respond. She was paralyzed, frozen in place, as the figure slowly reached out toward her. Its hand, or what passed for a hand, was long and thin, with fingers that seemed too long, too sharp. The figure moved closer, its arm outstretched, those glowing eyes never leaving hers. Just as its hand was about to touch her, she woke up with a start, gasping for air, her heart pounding in her chest. She sat up, clutching the blanket tightly around her, her eyes darting around the room. Everything was still, silent, but the feeling of dread lingered, thick and suffocating. She glanced at the clock, 3:17 a.m. Hours had passed since she'd seen the figure, but the memory of it was fresh, vivid in her mind. It was just a dream, she told herself, trying to calm her racing heart. Just a dream. But deep down, she knew it wasn't. Something was wrong, something far more sinister than a simple nightmare. She could feel it in the air, in the silence of the house, in the way her skin prickled with unease. For the next few days, Sarah tried to convince herself that what she had seen had been a figment of her imagination, a trick of the light, or a shadow cast by something outside. But every night, just after midnight, the tapping would begin again. Tap, 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 always at the window. And each night, the figure would return, standing just outside, staring in at her with those glowing, unblinking eyes. No matter how tightly she locked the window, no matter how many times she closed the curtains, it always found a way to return, watching, waiting, and each night, the dreams grew worse. The figure came closer, its hand reaching out to her, its presence more suffocating, more real. By the fourth night, Sarah could barely sleep at all. She lay in bed, wide awake, her eyes locked on the window, waiting for the inevitable sound of the tapping. Tap, tap, tap. It had become a part of her night, a ritual she couldn't escape, a horror she couldn't explain. And tonight, she had a sinking feeling that the figure wouldn't just stay outside. Tonight, it was coming in. She wasn't ready, but she didn't have a choice. The fifth night arrived with a sense of inevitability that made Sarah's stomach churn. She sat on her bed, knees drawn up to her chest, the room lit only by the pale light of her bedside lamp. The ticking of the clock felt louder than usual, each second dragging her closer to midnight, until the return of the figure outside her window. For days, she had debated what to do, whether to stay with a friend, leave the house, or call someone, anyone, who might help. But deep down, Sarah knew that leaving wouldn't matter. Whatever it was, the thing that appeared outside her window, it was not of this world. It wasn't something that would simply disappear if she left town, nor would it be something anyone else could fight for her. It was hers now, her burden, her terror. The dreams had gotten worse. Every night, the figure grew bolder, its presence more overwhelming. No longer confined to the edge of her vision or a fleeting shape outside, it had begun to take form in her room, as real as any nightmare could feel. But it was always almost the same. Just as the figure would reach out to her, touch her with its long, bony hand, she would wake up. The fear would cling to her, the sensation of its cold breath still fresh on her skin. She hadn't told anyone. She couldn't. What would she say? Who would believe her? A shadowy figure that comes to her window every night. It sounded insane, even to her. So, Sarah suffered in silence. Tonight, she sat, staring at the clock as it approached midnight. Her body was tense, her muscles tight with anxiety. She already knew what would happen just after midnight. The tapping would begin, soft at first, then louder, more persistent. And then the figure would appear, just as it always did. But tonight felt different. The air was thicker, heavier, like the calm before a storm. The minutes ticked by, and Sarah's breath grew shallow. She glanced toward the window, the curtains drawn tightly shut, but it did nothing to ease the knot in her stomach. She could feel the tension building, the suffocating weight of dread pressing down on her as the clock ticked closer to midnight. 11:59 p.m. Sarah's heart was pounding now, each beat thudding in her ears as if her own body was warning her. She clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. She couldn't keep living like this. Something had to change. Maybe tonight will be different, she thought, though she knew it was a lie. She didn't believe it for a second. Then the clock struck midnight. The room was deathly still for a long moment, and Sarah held her breath, waiting. For a few agonizing seconds, there was nothing. No sound, no tapping. But then it came. Tap, tap, tap. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The tapping was slow, deliberate, almost mocking in its persistence. It came from the window, just as it had every night before, but this time it felt different. Louder, closer. With a trembling hand, she reached for her phone on the nightstand. Her fingers hovered over the screen, her mind racing. Should she call someone? Would they even believe her? Before she could make a decision, the tapping grew louder, faster. Tap, 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 tap. Sarah's heart raced. She stood up, her legs unsteady beneath her. She moved toward the window, her eyes locked on the curtains. Her hands trembled as she reached out, fingers brushing the fabric. Just like the night before, she yanked the curtain aside, and there it was. The figure stood just outside the window, its shape illuminated by the dim moonlight. Its shadowy form was still indistinct, its face a blur of darkness, but those glowing eyes, two pinpricks of cold, white light, stared directly at her, unblinking, watching. Sarah's breath hitched, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, waiting. It was the waiting that unsettled her the most, like it was playing some sick game she didn't understand. Her fingers shook as she reached for the lock on the window, her instinct screaming at her to make sure it was secure. But before she could touch it, the figure shifted, its head tilted slightly, as if it were watching her, studying her. Then, slowly, it raised one hand, thin, bony fingers outstretched, and pressed it against the glass. Sarah stumbled back, her heart racing. The hand left a faint, foggy print on the glass, a twisted, smudged shape that sent a wave of nausea through her. She couldn't move, couldn't tear her eyes away from the handprint. Her body was frozen in place, her mind screaming at her to run, to do something, anything to stop it. And then the tapping stopped. The figure remained outside the window, unmoving, its hand still pressed against the glass. Sarah swallowed hard, forcing herself to breathe. Slowly, she backed away from the window, her eyes never leaving the shadowy form. She didn't know what to do. She didn't know how to fight something she didn't understand. As she stepped back toward the bed, her foot hit something on the floor, a small, crumpled piece of paper. She bent down, her hands trembling, and picked it up. It hadn't been there before. She hadn't seen it when she'd gone to bed, but now it lay there, as though it had been placed deliberately for her to find. She unfolded it with shaking hands, her heart racing as she read the words scrawled across the page in messy, jagged handwriting. "It's almost time." Sarah dropped the paper, her stomach churning with fear. She glanced toward the window, but the figure was gone, vanished into the night, as though it had never been there. The only trace of its presence was the foggy handprint smeared against the glass. Her mind reeled. What did the note mean? Almost time for what? The figure had been coming every night, standing outside her window, tapping, watching, but it had never done this before. It had never left a message. It had never pressed its hand against the glass. Panic surged through her, and she grabbed her phone, her fingers fumbling as she dialed the only person she could think of, her brother, Tom. He would know what to do. He had to. The phone rang once, twice, and then his grubby voice came through the line. "Sarah, it's past midnight. What's going on?" I need help," she whispered, her voice trembling. "There's something outside my window. It's been coming every night, and she swallowed hard. It left a note this time. It said it's almost time." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and when Tom spoke again, his voice was tense. "Sarah, are you sure you're not just dreaming? You've been under a lot of stress lately. Maybe I'm not imagining it," she snapped, her fear and frustration boiling over. "It's real, Tom. I've seen it every night for the past week. I'm not crazy. Okay, Tom said, his tone softer now. "Just take a deep breath. I'll come over, all right? I'll be there in 20 minutes. Don't open the door for anyone, okay? Just stay inside, lock everything, and wait for me." Sarah nodded, even though he couldn't see her. "Okay, please hurry." "I will," Tom promised. "Stay safe." She hung up the phone and sat on the edge of the bed, her hands shaking. The house was eerily quiet now, the ticking of the clock the only sound in the room. She glanced at the window again, but the figure was still gone. For now, Sarah's mind raced as she waited for Tom. What did the note mean? Why had the figure been coming every night, and what did it want from her? She had no answers, only fear, and the gnawing sense that something terrible was about to happen. Minutes passed like hours, each second stretching out into eternity. She glanced at the clock, 12:27 a.m. Tom would be here soon. But then a sound broke the silence. Not the tapping on the window this time, but something else. A creak, coming from inside the house. Sarah's blood ran cold. She stood up slowly, her heart hammering in her chest. She listened, straining to hear any other sounds, but the house was silent again. And then another creak. This time it was closer. She turned toward the bedroom door, her pulse racing. The door was closed, but the air around it felt heavy, like something was waiting on the other side. Something had found a way in. Sarah stood frozen in the middle of the room, her breath shallow and her heart pounding in her chest. The creaking continued, soft and deliberate, like slow footsteps moving through the hallway just outside her door. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to hide, but where could she go? The house felt like a trap, each room a cage that only led to another. She took a slow, trembling step back, her eyes locked on the door. It was still closed, but something or someone was on the other side. The air in the room had grown thick, oppressive, like the weight of something unseen pressing down on her. The same feeling she had when the figure appeared outside the window, except this time, it wasn't outside anymore. It was in the house. How did it get in? Sarah's mind raced. She had locked every door and window. She had checked and double-checked before going to bed, just like every other night, and yet, somehow, it had found a way in. The note it left came rushing back to her mind. It's almost time. Time for what? The footsteps stopped, and silence fell over the house. Sarah held her breath, straining to hear any sound, any movement, but the silence was suffocating. Her phone buzzed suddenly, and she jumped, nearly dropping it. She fumbled with it, glancing at the screen. It was a message from Tom. Almost there. Stay put. Relief flooded through her for a brief moment, but it was quickly replaced by dread. Tom was coming into the house, and whatever was inside would be waiting for him too. She had to warn him. She had to stop him from walking into the nightmare that had invaded her life. But before she could respond, the door to her room creaked. The handle twisted slowly, and the door began to inch open, revealing a sliver of darkness beyond. Sarah's heart stopped. It was here. Her body went rigid with fear, her legs refusing to move. She couldn't take her eyes off the door as it creaked open further, the darkness beyond swallowing the light from her lamp. The figure was there. She could feel it, sense its presence even though she couldn't see it yet. The air grew colder, the oppressive weight of dread making it hard to breathe. And then it stepped into the room. The figure was even more terrifying up close, its form still shadowy and indistinct, but there was something horribly real about it now. It was no longer just a figure standing outside her window. It was solid, tangible. Its impossibly long limbs seemed to stretch unnaturally, and its eyes, those glowing, unblinking pinpricks of light, locked onto hers with a cold, calculating intensity. It was inside now, standing in her bedroom, and there was no window between them this time. Sarah backed up slowly, her breath coming in short gasps as she tried to put as much distance as possible between her and the figure. But the room felt small, suffocating. There was nowhere to go. The figure didn't move at first. It just stood there, watching her, its presence like a dark shadow that filled the entire room. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint ticking of the clock on her nightstand. It was as if time itself had slowed, every second stretching into eternity. Finally, the figure took a step toward her. Sarah's body screamed at her to move, to do something, but she was paralyzed by fear. The figure took another step, its long, spindly fingers twitching as if reaching for her. The darkness around it seemed to pulse, growing thicker with every step it took. Then it spoke. Sarah. The voice was low, a rasping whisper that sent a chill down her spine. It didn't sound human. It sounded ancient, as if the very air around it was bending to its will, carrying the words like a cold wind. The sound of her own name coming from its lips made her blood run cold. Sarah, it's time. Time for what? Her mind raced, but she had no answers, only fear. She took another step back, her legs shaking, but the figure continued to advance, its movements slow, deliberate, like a predator closing in on its prey. Suddenly, there was a loud banging at the front door. Sarah, it's me. Open up. Tom's voice rang out through the house, urgent and filled with concern. The figure paused, its head tilting slightly, as if listening. For a brief moment, Sarah felt a surge of hope. Tom was here. He could help. But just as quickly, that hope was smothered by dread. The figure turned its gaze toward the door, then slowly shifted its attention back to Sarah. Its lips, or what passed for lips, curled into a grotesque semblance of a smile. He can't help you now, the figure whispered, its voice colder than before. No one can. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, and her mind screamed for her to do something. She couldn't let Tom walk into this nightmare. She had to stop him, had to warn him before it was too late. But the figure was so close now, its shadow enveloping her, pressing in on her like a physical force. The banging at the door grew louder. Sarah, are you okay? I'm coming in. The figure's smile widened, and it reached out, its long, bony hand extending toward her, fingers curling in the air like claws. Sarah backed away until her back hit the wall. She was trapped. Sarah, the figure whispered again, its voice filled with dark amusement. It's time. Her body finally reacted. She bolted toward the door, yanking it open just as Tom burst through the front door. She could hear him calling her name, his voice filled with panic. Tom, she screamed, her voice hoarse. Run, don't come in here. But it was too late. The figure's cold hand clamped down on her wrist, its grip like ice. Sarah gasped, the tub sending a wave of freezing cold through her entire body. She struggled, trying to pull away, but its grip was impossibly strong. The room seemed to grow darker, the walls closing in around her. And then, just as she thought she was lost, Tom appeared at the doorway. Sarah, his His eyes widened in horror as he saw the figure standing over her, its shadowy form looming like a nightmare made real. "Let her go," Tom shouted, rushing forward, his hand reaching for her. The figure turned its head slowly toward Tom, its glowing eyes narrowing. For a moment, everything seemed to slow. Time itself seemed to pause as the figure regarded Tom with a cold, calculating gaze. Then, with a sudden, violent motion, it flung Sarah across the room. She hit the floor hard, the breath knocked out of her as pain shot through her side. She tried to push herself up, but her limbs felt heavy, her body numb from the cold. She could hear Tom shouting, could see him lunging at the figure, but everything was a blur. The figure didn't react to Tom's attack. It stood still, like a shadow, unmoved by his presence. And then, with a flick of its hand, it sent Tom flying backward, crashing into the wall with a sickening thud. Sarah screamed. She struggled to her feet, her body trembling, but the figure was already moving toward Tom, its long fingers outstretched. "Leave him alone," she cried, desperation flooding her voice. But the figure ignored her. It bent over Tom, its fingers curling around his throat, lifting him off the ground with inhuman strength. Tom gasped for air, his eyes wide with terror as he struggled against the figure's grip, but it was no use. "Sarah," the figure rasped, its voice a whisper of cold wind. "You can't escape. It's already begun." Sarah's vision blurred with tears. She couldn't lose Tom. She couldn't let this thing take him. Summoning all her strength, she stumbled toward the figure, grabbing a heavy lamp from the nightstand and swinging it with all her might. The lamp shattered against the figure's back, and for a brief moment it released Tom, dropping him to the floor. He collapsed, gasping for breath. The figure turned toward Sarah, its eyes burning with fury. The room seemed to pulse with darkness, and she knew she had only made it angrier. But she didn't care. She had to save Tom. She had to fight. With a roar, the figure lunged at her. Time slowed, and Sarah braced herself for the impact. But just as the figure's hand reached for her, there was a blinding flash of light. The figure recoiled, hissing in pain, its form flickering like a dying flame. The light grew brighter, filling the room with a warm, golden glow. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the light vanished. The figure was gone. The room was plunged back into darkness as the blinding light disappeared. Sarah stood there, frozen, her heart racing and her hands shaking as her eyes struggled to adjust. The figure was gone, but was it truly gone? She didn't know if she could believe that. Tom lay on the floor, gasping for air. She rushed to his side, dropping to her knees and helping him sit up. His face was pale, eyes wide with disbelief. "Tom, are you okay?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Tom nodded weakly, wincing as he rubbed his throat. What was that thing?" he rasped, his voice raw from the figure's crushing grip. Sarah didn't have an answer. The figure had been haunting her every night, standing outside her window like a specter, and now it had broken into her home, threatened her and her brother, and then vanished in a flash of light. What was it? Why had it come for her? "I don't know," she finally managed, her voice barely audible. "It's been coming every night, Tom, every night, outside my window, watching me." She shuddered, the memory of the figure's cold, glowing eyes burning in her mind. And tonight it came inside. Tom groaned as he pushed himself up, leaning against the bed for support. I saw its eyes." His voice was thick with disbelief. What does it want from you?" Sarah shook her head. "I don't know. It left a note last night. It said, 'It's almost time.'" She pulled the crumpled note from her pocket and handed it to him. "I don't know what it means. I'm scared, Tom. It said no one could help me." Tom stared at the note, his brow furrowing as he read the ominous words. He didn't speak for a long moment, his face growing darker with worry. "We need to figure out what this thing is," he said finally, his voice firm. "We need to stop it, whatever it is." Sarah nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. "But how? How do you stop something like this? It's not human." Tom struggled to his feet, his face set with determination. "There has to be a way. These things don't just happen. There's always a reason." Sarah wasn't so sure. The figure wasn't like anything she had ever seen before. It was more than just a shadow or a ghost. It was something ancient, something evil. It felt like a force that had been waiting for her, stalking her, and she didn't know why. "Let's get out of here," Tom said, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward the door. "We need to leave this house. We can go to my place. Maybe if we're somewhere else, it won't be able to find us." Sarah hesitated, her eyes flicking toward the window where the figure had always appeared. Could she really leave? Would it just follow her, no matter where she went? Or was it bound to this place, to this house? "Okay," she whispered, fear and exhaustion weighing her down. "Let's go." They hurried out of the bedroom, moving quickly through the darkened hallway and down the stairs. Every creak of the old wooden steps made Sarah jump, her nerves on edge. She half expected the figure to reappear, to block their escape, but the house remained eerily silent. When they reached the front door, Sarah grabbed her coat and keys, her hands shaking. She could feel the oppressive weight of the house around her, like it was watching her leave, like it knew she couldn't escape. Tom opened the door, and they stepped out into the cool night air. The cold breeze felt sharp against her skin, but it was a relief after the stifling heaviness of the house. She inhaled deeply, trying to steady herself, but her mind was still racing with fear. As they walked to Tom's car, parked at the curb, Sarah glanced back at the house. The windows were dark, the porch bathed in shadow. It looked normal, just a quiet, suburban home, but she knew better. The figure was still inside, waiting. Is it really over? They got into the car, and Tom started the engine. The headlights cut through the darkness as they pulled away from the house, leaving it behind. Sarah watched it disappear in the rearview mirror, her heart heavy with a sense of foreboding. For the first time in a week, she wasn't trapped inside, waiting for the figure to come for her. She was free, at least for now. But as the car sped down the quiet streets, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. The figure wasn't done with her. Do you think it'll follow us? Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Tom glanced at her, his expression serious. I don't know, but if it does, we'll find a way to stop it. We have to. They drove in silence for a while, the street lights casting long shadows on the road. The night felt unnaturally still, as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Sarah kept glancing out the window, half expecting to see the figure standing at the side of the road, watching them, but it never appeared. When they finally reached Tom's apartment, Sarah felt a small sense of relief. It was safer here, away from the house, away from the window where the figure had always appeared. But as they walked up the stairs to his apartment, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. Once inside, Tom locked the door behind them, double-checking the locks. Sarah sat down on the couch, her hands still trembling. She felt like she was coming apart at the seams, her mind fraying with the weight of everything that had happened. Tom sat down next to her, his face grim. We need to figure out what this thing is, Sarah. If it's after you, there has to be a reason. Sarah nodded, but she felt lost. How could they possibly fight something like this? It wasn't just a ghost or a nightmare. It was real, and it had nearly killed Tom tonight. She didn't know if she could survive another encounter with it. I've been thinking, Tom said after a long silence. What if it's tied to the house? Maybe something happened there, something that's connected to whatever this thing is. Sarah frowned. Like what? I don't know, Tom admitted, but we need to look into it. There's got to be some kind of history to that house, something that explains why this thing is targeting you. Sarah bit her lip. The thought of going back to the house, of confronting whatever evil lurked there, made her stomach churn with fear. But Tom was right. They couldn't just run forever. They needed answers. Okay, she said quietly, we'll figure it out. They spent the rest of the night researching the house, combing through old records, and looking for any information that might explain the figure's presence. The house had been built in the 1800s, a relic of the town's early days. Over the years, it had changed hands many times, with no obvious history of tragedy or violence. But there were rumors, stories of strange occurrences, of people leaving in the middle of the night without explanation. Then they found something. An article from decades ago, buried deep in the archives, mentioned a woman who had lived in the house. Her name was Abigail Holloway, and she had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. The article described her as a recluse, someone who rarely left the house. But what stood out to Sarah was the description of Abigail's obsession with the supernatural. She had been convinced that someone was watching her, following her, waiting to take her away. Just like Sarah, the article ended abruptly, with no resolution to Abigail's disappearance. She had simply vanished, leaving behind only whispers of her madness. Sarah's blood ran cold as she stared at the article. Was Abigail's fate tied to her own? Had the figure taken her, just as it was trying to take Sarah now? We need to go back, Tom said quietly, his voice tense. We need to find out what really happened in that house. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. The thought of returning to the house filled her with dread, but she knew Tom was right. If they didn't confront the figure, it would keep coming for her. It wouldn't stop until it got what it wanted. Okay, she whispered, her voice barely audible. We'll go back. They had no choice. The drive back to the house was filled with silence. Sarah sat rigid in her seat, her mind racing with thoughts of the figure, the house, and Abigail Holloway. Was she walking into the same fate that had claimed Abigail? The thought gnawed at her, sending waves of dread through her body. The house loomed ahead, dark and foreboding against the night sky, its windows like black, soulless eyes. Tom pulled into the driveway and turned off the engine. Neither of them moved. The oppressive weight of the house seemed to extend beyond its walls, seeping into the air around them. "We don't have to do this tonight," Tom said quietly, sensing Sarah's hesitation. But Sarah knew they did. The figure would come for her again if they didn't put an end to this now. She could feel it. Its presence was still lingering, watching, waiting. This was the only way to end it, to break free from whatever hold the house had on her. "No," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "We have to." Tom nodded, his jaw set with determination. They exited the car, the cold night air biting at their skin, and made their way toward the front door. Sarah's hands trembled as she fumbled with the key, but after a moment of struggle, the door creaked open, revealing the darkness inside. The house seemed even more oppressive now than it had before. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, as if they were alive. Sarah stepped inside, a heart pounding in her chest, and Tom followed close behind. They moved cautiously through the house, their footsteps echoing in the silence. The creaks of the floorboards seemed louder, more deliberate, like a warning. Sarah's eyes darted to the windows, expecting to see the figure standing outside, watching them. But there was nothing, only darkness. "The basement," Tom whispered. "That's where we need to go. If there's something hidden in this house, it's down there." Sarah swallowed hard, her throat dry. She had always hated the basement. The air down there was colder, and the shadows seemed to cling to the walls. But Tom was right. If the figure was tied to the house, there had to be something hidden, some secret they hadn't yet uncovered. Together, they made their way to the basement door. The wooden door groaned as Tom pushed it open, revealing the steep, narrow stairs that led into the darkness below. A cold draft wafted up from the depths, carrying with it the faint smell of damp earth and decay. "Do you have the flashlight?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Tom nodded and pulled it out, switching it on. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but it did little to alleviate the growing sense of dread. Slowly, they descended the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. When they reached the bottom, Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The basement was larger than she remembered, the walls lined with old, rotting wood. The air was freezing, and the dampness clung to her skin like ice. The flashlight's beam swept across the room, revealing stacks of old boxes, forgotten furniture, and cobwebs thick enough to make her shiver. "What are we looking for?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Anything," Tom replied. "Anything that might explain why this thing is here." They began searching through the clutter, sifting through boxes filled with old books, letters, and remnant of the house's past. Sarah's hands trembled as she opened each box, her mind racing with fear. What if they found nothing? What if the figure was simply waiting for them, biding its time before it appeared again? As she rifled through another box of dusty old letters, Tom's voice broke the silence. "Sarah, over here." She turned to see him standing in the far corner of the basement, the flashlight's beam focused on a section of the wall. Her heart raced as she walked over to him, her eyes following the light. There, half hidden beneath layers of dust and grime, was a small door embedded in the wall, barely noticeable at first glance. "What is that?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking. "I don't know," Tom replied, kneeling down to inspect it. The door was old, the wood rotting and the hinges rusted. "It looks like a crawl space or something." Sarah's pulse quickened. This had to be it. This was what the figure was tied to. The answers they were seeking were behind that door. She knelt beside Tom, her hands trembling as they worked together to pry the door open. After several moments of effort, the wood finally gave way, and the door creaked open, revealing a dark, narrow passageway. The air that came out of the passage was even colder than the basement, and it carried a foul, musty odor that made Sarah's stomach turn. She peered inside, her heart racing. The passage was small, barely big enough to crawl through, and it seemed to stretch back into the darkness for several feet. "We have to go in," Tom said, his voice tense. Sarah hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, to leave the house and never return. But she couldn't. She had to know. She had to stop whatever evil was tied to this place. With a deep breath, Sarah nodded. "Okay, let's go." Tom went first, crawling into the narrow passageway with the flashlight clutched tightly in his hand. Sarah followed close behind, the walls pressing in on her as they moved deeper into the darkness. The smell grew stronger, and the air was so cold it made her teeth chatter. After what felt like an eternity, they reached the end of the passage. Tom's flashlight flickered as he shone it around, revealing a small, hidden room. The walls were lined with strange symbols, drawn in what looked like dried blood. In the center of the room was an old, crumbling altar, covered in dust and cobwebs. On the altar lay a single object, an old, leather-bound book. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the book. The air in the room seemed to vibrate with a dark energy, and she could feel the weight of something evil pressing down on her. This was it. This was the source of the figure's power. Tom reached for the book, but Sarah grabbed his arm. "Wait," she whispered. "What if touching it? What if that's what it wants?" Tom hesitated, his hand hovering over the book. "We have to know, Sarah. We have to stop it." Before Sarah could protest, Tom grabbed the book. The moment his fingers touched the leather cover, the air in the room seemed to shift. A low, guttural whisper filled the space, echoing off the walls. The symbols on the walls began to glow faintly, pulsing with a sickly light. "Tom," Sarah gasped, backing away. "What did you do?" Tom opened the book, his eyes scanning the pages. "It's a ritual," he said, his voice filled with urgency. "A summoning ritual. Whoever lived here summoned that thing, summoned the figure." Sarah's heart raced. "How do we stop it?" Tom's eyes darted over the pages, his face growing pale. "It says here, the only way to stop it is to send it back. We have to complete the ritual, reverse the summoning." "But how?" Sarah asked, her voice filled with panic. Tom's hands trembled as he read the words. "We need blood. Blood from the one it's marked." Sarah's blood ran cold. "It's marked me, Tom. It's after me." Tom's eyes met hers, filled with fear. "I know." Before Sarah could react, the air in the room grew colder, and the shadows began to move. The figure appeared in the corner of the room, its glowing eyes locked onto Sarah. Its long, spindly fingers reached out toward her, and the room filled with the sound of its raspy whisper. "It's time, Sarah," the figure said, its voice cold and menacing. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. This was it, the moment she had been dreading. She looked at Tom, her eyes filled with fear. "Do it," she whispered. "Finish the ritual." Tom hesitated, but he knew what had to be done. With a shaking hand, he grabbed the small knife from the altar and made a shallow cut on Sarah's arm. Blood dripped onto the pages of the book, and the symbols on the walls began to glow brighter. The figure let out a horrible, guttural scream as the ritual took hold. Its form flickered, twisting and contorting as the air around it pulsed with dark energy. Sarah's body trembled, the cold biting into her bones. And then, with a blinding flash of light, the figure was gone. The room fell silent. The oppressive weight lifted, and the cold dissipated. Sarah collapsed to the ground, her body weak and trembling. Tom rushed to her side, his face filled with relief. "It's over," he whispered. "It's finally over." Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face. The figure was gone. The nightmare was finally over. But deep down, she knew that something had changed. Something dark still lingered within her, a mark left by the figure. It wasn't truly over, and she wasn't sure it ever would be.